Welcome to our Lebanon channel. Politics of Sidon. This sectarian and demographic division rose to the surface during the Lebanese Civil War, when armed clashes erupted between Sunni Muslims and Christians. The clashes ended with the surrender of the Christian front, and the Christians were forced to move to East Beirut. After the war ended in 1990, the Christians have gradually returned to their hometowns, and in the year 2000 many fled to Israel. The local politics of Sidon in the 20th century was mainly dominated up till the 1980s by allegiances around two main families, the El-Bizri and Saad. The El-Bizri politicians were known for their business connections, close ties with eminent Lebanese and Levantine leaders, and their bent on serving the Lebanese state as government ministers, officials and mayors. The Saad politicians tended to be populist and became engaged in violent protests in the 1940s, 1950s and then during the Lebanese Civil War as Nasserites, populist followers of Nasser in Lebanon. The local political conflict between these two families was always resolved through amicable means and ties of kinship. Their hold over the political aspects of the city was similar to that of Mediterranean families in Sicily, or to being also influenced by the ties of Arab families, clans, and tribes in traditionalist forms. The most notable figures of the El-Bizri family in the first half of the 20th century were Ahmed El-Bizri, born 1899, Salah El-Bizri, Izzeddin El-Bizri, commonly known as Aitso, and Anwar El-Bizri, born 1910. These four brothers were businessmen and politicians who dominated the political life of the city up till the late 1940s, using traditional inherited forms of governance since Ottoman times. With intelligence and strength they maintained their power for over 50 years. It is from their ranks that Maruf Saad started his public life, and their close cousins, Natsi El-Bizri, Amin El-Bizri, and Fuad El-Bizri became the next generation of politicians and statesmen in Lebanon, holding positions as ministers and members of parliament. The El-Bizri and the Saad political practices were bent on social justice and on local service in public affairs. The El-Bizri was since the Ottoman rule bent on serving the state, and this continued with their loyalty and support to the successive governments of Lebanon since the times of independence. They also helped eminent politicians and statesmen from Sidonian descent such as the Prime Ministers Riyad Sol, Taqi el-Din Sol and Rashid Sol. They also gave their support to former Prime Minister Saab Salam, father of the current Lebanese Prime Minister, Tamim Salam. The presence of the El-Bizris was at times intimidating on the local scene, but they were also known for their goodwill and dignified public service. The Saad family developed their links with Nasserism in the 1950s and engaged in the uprising and armed protest of 1958 against the government of the Lebanese President Chamoun. They also became involved in the civil war as part of the left-wing politics of the Lebanon al-Haraka al-Wataniya with PLO connections, and they actively contributed to resisting the Israeli occupation after 1982. The Saads remained populist in their politics and focused on the grassroots, while the El-Bizri were generally appealing to the middle and upper classes. In the middle 1980s, the Hariri family started to rise to prominence and it became the most influential in Sidon in political and financial terms, even though the presence of the Saad and the El-Bizri in local politics remained significant at the level of visibility and activism. The politics of Sidon is similar to that of the traditional old cities of the Levant in the sense of being family-based. In broad terms, one could say that the El-Bizri family had an influence since Ottoman times, and most significantly during the entirety of the 20th century. It was local in impact at first, but then the members of this family became influential within the Lebanese state and institutions, and they supported the sole family that had successive prime ministers and that moved its power base from Sidon to Beirut. The Saad family developed its original politics from within the sphere of influence of the El-Bizri family and then became a power to reckon with on its own after 1948, and most powerfully in 1958, then in the Civil War and up till today. Maruf Saad, the leader of his family, and a local influential politician, was assassinated at the eve of the Lebanese Civil War in 1975. The Saads retained their populism and grassroots appeal, and attracted a core of loyal adherents since the middle of the 20th century. while the El Bizri were Levantine in their Arabism, namely focused mainly on Bilad al-Sham in regional politics, and the Sol being also similar to them in this. The Saad were leaning more towards a broader Pan-Arabism, Nasserite, Libyan, and then Syrian. As for the Hariri family, they are regionally focused on Saudi orientations in politics. The Hariri family started to rise to political and economic prominence in the 1980s and became perhaps the most influential family in Lebanon by the middle 1990s. It is now one of the most organized in political terms, and it follows modern forms of political practice through a large party future movement that cuts across various economic classes, but that is usually seen as a Sunni political movement with regional weight due to its close ties with Saudi Arabia. Impact on Sidon of regional underdevelopment. According to a recent United Nations Development Programme (UNDP) report, data also point to an increase in urban poverty, especially in Lebanon's largest cities suburbs such as Beirut, Tripoli and Saida, as illustrated by poverty-driven symptoms, child labor, overcrowding and deteriorated environment conditions. In another UNDP report, the author discusses the development predominance of Beirut over the rest of the regions of Lebanon, North, South and Bekaa, is a well-known imbalance that can be dated to the early 19th century. With the expansion of Beirut in the 1870s, urban growth in the future capital city outgrew Tripoli and Saida. Transportation routes, missionary schools, universities and hospitals, as well as the Beirut port development and the commerce of silk, participated to the fortification of Beirut as a major trade center for Mediterranean exchange. Arno 1993, Labaki 1999. However, the establishment of Great Lebanon in 1920, under the French Mandate, added the poorer areas of the north Akkar, Bekaa, Baalbek Hermel, and the south Jabal Armal to the relatively affluent cities of Mount Lebanon. This addition made of Lebanon a country composed of unequally developed regions. This legacy remains a heavy load to bear socially, culturally, economically and politically. Even though the public policies elaborated by the young Lebanese state were attempting to have regional perspectives, the early urban planning schemes reveal a development approach exclusively axed on Beirut and its suburbs. The post-war development policy of the state, promoted by Hariri government 1992–1998, was centered around balanced development and is widely inspired by the 1943 Pact and the 1989 TAIF Agreement (Labaki 1993 Smiley Face). However, the application of this policy aims mainly at the rehabilitation and construction of roads and infrastructures, electricity, telephone, sewage. Another of its components is the rehabilitation of government buildings, airport, port, schools, universities and hospitals. Transportation projects, mainly concentrated on the coastal line, constitute 25% of the budget of 10-year economic plan developed by the CDR BAALBAKI 1994–90. However, all these projects are predominantly concentrated around Beirut, ignoring the regions. Local government. The city of Sidon is administrated by the municipality of Sidon. The municipality is constituted of a council of 21 members including the city mayor and his deputy. It has administrative and financial independence but remains under the control and supervision of the central government, specifically the Ministry of Interior. The municipality's jurisdiction is limited to a region of 786 hectares in area and 5 meters in elevation, while each of the city's suburbs is administrated by its own independent municipal council. Sidon is the center of the Governorate of South Lebanon, and hosts the seat of the Governor of Southern Lebanon. The city is also the center of the Sidon District and the Union of Sidon and Zahrani municipalities, founded in 1978 and contains 15 municipalities. Sidon hosts the southern regional headquarters of a series of governmental facilities like the Central Bank of Lebanon, Electricité du Liban, Central Telecommunications Station and others. It is also the home of the Justice Palace of South Lebanon in its new headquarters on East Boulevard. The old headquarters were an old Ottoman sarai that is currently occupied by the LSF and is planned to be transformed into a cultural center by the municipality. In the 2000 and 2005 parliamentary elections, the Sidon district along with the Tyre and Bint Jbeil districts formed the first electoral district of South Lebanon. However, in the 2009 elections, and due to the reactivation of the 1960 electoral law, the city of Sidon was separated from its district to form a separate electoral district. Demographics. Sidon is the seat of the Greek Melkite Catholic Archbishop of Sidon and Deir el-Qamar, and has housed a significant Catholic population throughout its history. Sidon also hosts the seat of the Shiite Ayatollah of South Lebanon. In the 1930s, when Lebanon was still under the French mandate, Sidon had the largest Jewish population in Lebanon, estimated at 3,588, compared to 3,060 in Beirut. Main sites. Sidon Sea Castle, a fortress built by the Crusaders in the early 13th century. It is located near the port of Sidon. Sidon Soap Museum. It traces the history of the soap making in the region and its different manufacturing steps. Khan el-Franj, caravansary of the French, built by Emir Fakhreddin in the 17th century to accommodate French merchants and goods in order to develop trade with Europe. This is a typical khan with a large rectangular courtyard and a central fountain surrounded by covered galleries. Debane Palace, a historical residence built in 1721, an example of Arab Ottoman architecture. It is currently in the process of being transformed into the History Museum of Sidon. This villa was earlier occupied by the Hamoud family in the 18th century and also by members of the famous Ottoman aristocrats of the Abaza clan in the late 19th century and early 20th century. The vaults at the ground level being originally stables for the villa residents and then turned into shops as part of the old souks, and known until recent time by association to the Abazas. The Castle of St. Louis, Qalat al-Muizz. It was built by the Crusaders in the 13th century on top of the remains of a fortress built by the Fatimid Caliph al-Muizz. It is located to the south of the old souks near Murex Hill. Eshmun Temple, dedicated to the Phoenician god of healing. Built in the 7th century BC, it is located in the north of Sidon near the Awali River. The British War Cemetery in Sidon. Opened in 1943 by units of His Majesty's King George VI British forces occupying the Lebanon after the 1941 campaign against the Vichy French troops. It was originally used for the burial of men who died while serving with the occupation force, but subsequently the graves of a number of the casualties of the 1941 campaign were moved into the cemetery from other burial grounds or from isolated positions in the vicinity. The cemetery now contains 176 Commonwealth burials of the Second World War and 9 war graves of other nationalities. It was designed by G. Vey. It is perhaps that only garden in modern Sidon that is elegantly kept and cared for. It is not a public garden but can be visited when the wardens have its gateways open. Khan Seysi in Sidon. Khan Seysi has undergone a series of modifications and tells part of the city's past. In its heart, it hides a much older story. It is composed of rooms of a majestic height with 3 water wells, 3 hammams and an oven. Education. Sidon is home to numerous educational facilities ranging from public elementary schools to private universities. According to a 2006 study, the city is home to 29 schools that serve a total of 18,731 students, 37% are in public schools, 63% are in private schools. Sidon also contains 10 universities, 5 of which are private universities. Archaeology. Sidon I is an archaeological site located to the east of the city, south of the road to Jazim. An assemblage of flint tools was found by P. E. Gigues suggested to date between 3800 and 3200 BC. The collection included narrow axes or chisels that were polished on one side and flaked on the other, similar to ones found at Ansheikh, Nar Zarani and Gelal en Namus. The collection appears to have gone missing from the Archaeological Museum of the American University of Beirut. Sidon 2 is said to be near the church, at approximately 50 meters above sea level. P. E. Gigues suggested that the industry found on the surface of this site dated to the Acheulean. Sidon 3 was found by E. Passamar in the 1920s, who made a collection of material that is now in the National Museum of Beirut marked Camp de l'Aviation. It includes large flint and chert bifacials that may be of heavy Neolithic origin. Sidon IV is the tell mound of ancient Sidon with early Bronze Age 3200 BC deposits, now located underneath the ruined St. Louis Castle and what are also thought to be the ruins of a Roman theatre. The area around Sidon contains three important necropoli. Necropolis of Ardlo, Necropolis of Aya near Halali, Necropolis of An al-Hilway southeast, in indication of the high profile of the old city of Sidon in archaeological expeditions, and mainly in the 19th century. In October 1860, the famous French scholar Ernest Renan was entrusted with an archaeological mission to Lebanon, which included the search for the antique parts of Sidon. The Phoenician inscriptions that he discovered, and his field data, were eventually published in his notebook, the Mission de Phénicie (1864–1874) Phoenician Expedition. The St. Louis land castle grounds were excavated in 1914–1920 by a French team. Then eastwards a new site was also excavated by another generation of French expeditions in the 1960s. This same site received renewed attention in 1998 when the Directorate General of Antiquities in Lebanon authorized the British Museum to begin excavations on this area of land that was specifically demarcated for archaeological research. This has resulted in published papers, with a special focus on studying ceramics. The archaeological fieldwork was not fully undertaken since the independence of the Lebanon. The main finds are displayed in the National Museum in Beirut. The fieldwork was also interrupted during the long Civil War period, and it is now resumed but at a timid and slow scale, and not involving major international expeditions or expertise. Perhaps this is also indicative of the general lack in cultural interests among the authorities of this city, and almost of the non-existence of notable intellectual activities in its modern life. There are signs that the locals are beginning to recognize the value of the medieval quarters, but this remains linked to minor individual initiatives and not a coordinated collective effort to rehabilitate it like it has been the case with Byblos, even though the old district of Sidon contains a great wealth in old and ancient architecture. Thank you for watching. Like, share and subscribe.